So let's take a few minutes to talk about CSS, or cascading style sheets. They provide a way to style elements across a site, and it really is a powerful way for us to start applying design techniques to our HTML. You might have been frustrated working with HTML because you couldn't make it do certain things. But remember, HTML just structures the element. It provides context for the elements, but not the style. It provides context for the content on the page. And if you allow CSS to control the style, you can actually cascade your styles throughout an entire website that may have thousands of pages and be able to control things like what a font that you're using for paragraphs, what that looks like, or the size of things or colors. So it can be used for all different types of layout and styling features. And there are three different ways that you can apply a style sheet or apply CSS to your page. And the preferred method is this first method, where you would include a link to the style sheet in the head of every HTML page that you're working with. So you would have this link element, and the relationship or rel attribute would be style sheet. The href is the most important thing here because that is the link to the actual external style sheet. And then the type equals text/CSS. If you put this in here and you have the right name of your style sheet with a .css extension, they must have a .css extension, then all those styles in that style sheet will apply to your page. In this case, I'm indicating that it is in a CSS folder. So you have to also understand relatively where the CSS page is to the HTML page that you're working on. Another method of applying styles is doing them in the head of the document within the style elements, so the opening style and the closing style elements, and then in that document you can indicate your styles in the head. Now this would only apply to the document in which they are in the head, and so that limits your ability to have a cascade across thousands of pages, and that's very powerful when you have a client who says, I suddenly would like the font to be bigger or a different color or a different font family. But sometimes there are websites that are just one HTML page. Many Bootstrap sites now just have one page that your navigation is just making anchors to places within the page. And in that case, it would be appropriate to have styles in the head of the document. So you can see some styles here. We have a style for a paragraph. We have the curly braces opening and closing. And then within those curly braces, we're including the name of the style that we're using, which is the property, and then the actual value of that property. So font family Helvetica, font size 14px. All the paragraphs in this document would have those things applied to them. And that's exactly the kind of CSS that you would put in your external style sheet. You would have the name of the element, the opening and closing curly braces, and then be able to put all the styles that you want in it. We'll look at that in some examples. And then inline is the least preferred method. You put it exactly on an HTML element right within the HTML. It's only going to apply to that element, and it is going to supersede and override anything that's in your style sheet. So you would want to use these sparingly, if at all. This is the style attribute equal, and then you put the property and the value within that. Quite often, we want to use CSS for layout. CSS is very powerful, and it lets us use different layouts, lets us very quickly apply a different layout to the content that you have on your site. Say you have a redesign coming, or you have some sort of a new branding approach. And it also is responsible for helping sites be more responsive. So if you recall, we talked about using IDs once on a page. And in the HTML, we would indicate the name of that ID. We could call it whatever we wanted. In this case, I'm calling it header. Maybe in my header, I'm having things like the logo and the navigation of the page. And so that's indicated in the HTML div ID equal header. And all those things would go in there. And then we would finally close it with a /div element. And then in the CSS, we indicate an ID with the hashtag or the pound sign, and we give it the name that we've indicated as the ID, and we have the opening and closing curly braces, and then within that we have our properties and their values. And so in this case, I want to say the width is 100% of the window that it's in, and margin auto is the code for making it centered on the page. Notice that each line is also separated by a semicolon, very important. So the syntax is the name of the property with a colon and the value, and then a semicolon between each one. Now also notice that I've used a % for the width. And sometimes you can use pixels for width and height and things like that. But in order to make things responsive, we probably want to use some sort of a %, so that as the window gets smaller, or if we're on a much smaller device, it knows to go by the % as opposed to trying to force pixels and making the site look like it's going off the screen. Quite often we'll also apply a max width, and I'll show you this in the example, because there are very giant screens now, and sometimes we don't want the site to expand across the entire screen. So for responsive design, we just talked about % using width 100% and using that instead of pixels. We can also apply max width to images so they don't exceed the bounding boxes that they're in, the divs that they're within. That gets a little bit more advanced. And then also we have media queries. And so for everything that doesn't get handled naturally by the % widths, we sometimes want to include media queries that say, well, at this size, or at this size or below, or at this size or above, I want to override what we have, because maybe at the small size we need a font size to be smaller, and I'll show you this in the example. So at the end of the style sheet, we would include a media query section, and we would indicate the max width or the min width. Either one of these works. In this case, it's saying anything under 480px would have the styles we would include here. So I'll show you that in the example. Quite often people design at the smallest size, and then they'll use the media queries for min widths, which means that size and above. So you'll see both of those things. And then the final important item in responsive design is that you do have to include this meta viewport element, this meta viewport code, to override what the device wants to do, which is to show your site without the media queries. It wants to just make a sort of a squished down version of your website on the page, and not your mobile optimized version of it. So if you put this on here, it tells it what the initial scale should be for the device width. And this will make sure that, particularly when it's opening in an iPhone, that it shows your responsive version and not just a squished down version of the site. So let's look at some sample CSS. As I mentioned in this example, because we're just working with one HTML page, I am going to include the styles in the head of the document. So I have the opening style element and the closing style element all the way down here before the head closes. But ideally, if I were having a multiple page website, I would want to have all these styles in their own CSS page, and then I'd have that link to the CSS page here in the head. But just to make things easier for you so that you can start goofing around with this, I'm going to provide this page to you. So if you look in the HTML, it's mostly what we had before. I have set up some divs as the sections of the site so that we can have a header, we can have some navigation, we can have a section with content, and we can have a footer. And so those are just the IDs that we're using as layout sections for the page. So if we look at the styles, I've got some generic styles up here to tell the body what it should look like, and show the background color or the text color of the page. And in brackets, it actually, if you hover over it, it lets you know what those color codes actually are. These are hexadecimal codes. If you also notice down here, I kept the attributes for the body that we used previously to get the beige color and the color of the links and the visited links. But these will be overridden by the things now in the style sheet, and we can actually take those attributes out if we wanted to, because they're not necessary anymore. We're going to be using the things in the body here. We're going to have font family, and we have several options here in case the user doesn't have one of these. We have the background color, the color, and then we have some margins that we've applied. And then we have some font sizes for an H1. We have some application of paragraphs for sizes and margins. We have what we want the links to look like, so the color that it's going to be, whether or not it's going to be underlined. Sometimes we get rid of the underline. What it's going to look like when it's visited. And we now can introduce this idea of a hover. So if you've ever hovered over a link and it changed colors or the way that it looked, it's because that there's now this CSS hover that we don't have in regular HTML. These elements that have the hashtag or the pound sign in front of them, that's what I was talking about before, where we can set up certain types of styles just to apply to that particular element, that particular ID. And so you can see here I have the % width, and I also put that max width here. For each one of these elements, I don't want it to get any wider than 1024 px. So that it doesn't, if it's a giant screen, it doesn't go all the way across the screen. I also have the margin auto, and I have them all set up as position relative, which just means that they will go in the order that they are on the page, as opposed to any sort of absolute positioning. For the nav, that's our navigation area. I've got what it's supposed to look like here and some borders and stuff on it. But then I also have some special styles for lists and A elements that are just within the nav. And you'll be able to notice how those are different because they're going to have a different color and look than other types of links on the site, which we've defined up here. These are just regular links, any other link on the site. These are the links and the lists within the nav ID. And you'll also notice that I've established this to allow the navigation to not have bullets and to display in line, display across instead of up and down. And then you see some things for the section and for the footer. And then finally, I have a class. So dot small, and you indicate a special class with a dot. And we're going to just name it small. I want this to be smaller text, 8px, and italicized. And I have an element way at the bottom for my copyright, and I just say class equals small. So that's a little bit different than the IDs. And then now, really finally, we have a media query example. Now, I have not used extensive media queries. I'm just showing you this to demonstrate. But here's the media query for a max width of 480. That's sort of a phone size. And it's saying that the nav should have a smaller height and that the font size should be a little bit smaller. So if we go to the page and actually refresh the page, this is what it looked like before when we were just applying HTML. But I have a different file that has the CSS in it. If we look at that, this is the exact same HTML page, but now with some styling applied to it. So you can see that it does have % widths associated with it. The size is getting smaller, but it only goes as much up to 1024, and that it is centered. And you'll also notice that we have some bigger links here that are within a navigation area, and that we have different colors and a hover for our links. And we have the small text down here for our copyright. But if we size this all the way down to below 480px, the phone size, you see how our links get smaller in the navigation and our nav bar got a little bit smaller. That's just an example of one of the types of things you might want to use for a media query. And again, this is a pretty rough site. We're just applying some of the basic elements to it, but there's a lot more that you can do with CSS. And so that's why I want to point you to Code Actually again, because I have a lot of tutorials on CSS and on responsive design, a lot of sample code that you can use here that you'll be able to work with to be able to learn more about how CSS and responsive design work. So I'm going to provide this file to you so that you can play with it, that you can make it your own. You can change it, you can change colors, and you can change how these things look. You can kind of tear it apart and see how you manipulate one thing and how it changes when you refresh the page. And so if you will go through and change the content as well as any styling that you want to do on this page, this will help you understand the HTML and CSS that you're going to need when you come to the class and we start applying JavaScript and interactivity to it.